Hello friends, this is Masood Ramandi. I trust that you've been in God's peace and you are in God's peace and you are growing in the knowledge of the Lord and you're experiencing His life day after day. Today we are moving into the story of the nation of Israel. Until now we have covered story of individuals like Adam, Eve, Abel and Cain, and later on through them we looked at the story of Noah and eventually the story of one nation, one kingdom, which was Babylon. But then out of that again we moved to individuals like Abraham, who actually received a promise that from him a seed would come that would be the blessing for all nations. So today we are moving to a nation, and the nation of Israel, because we're going to look at these stories in a bit more details over the next few weeks to see what actually happened through them, and then realize that everything that we are experiencing in Christ is a fulfillment of all those foreshadowings that came through those old stories. Because this is very important. Often I realize that actually we read the scriptures in the New Testament, whether it be what Jesus said or the apostles said or even the book of Revelation, and because we don't have that background of the Old Testament scriptures, we don't understand what they are referring to. So we try to understand them and we even get some understanding, but we don't get to the root of the understanding, and we kind of rob ourselves from that blessing. So if there is anything that's said in the New Testament, it finds its root in the Old Testament scriptures. So we've looked at what the story of Adam represents today. We looked at the story of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. We looked at what happened between Cain and Abel, and also the story of Noah, what that means, and the story of Babylon and that kingdom that actually tried to establish itself. And also for the past couple of sessions, we looked at the story of Abraham and God's promise of redemption, because the story of Jesus is the story of redemption. So God, through basically all those stories, showed us how man was made to be the image and likeness of God in chapter 1. And in chapter 3, he fell out of that image and likeness, trying to say he actually lost sight of the knowledge of God, what God was revealing. And then God came and said, I'm going to redeem you from this. But we looked at actually the effort of man, never actually achieving anything, never accomplishing anything, never coming to the life of God. And God came and promised to Abraham. But he said the seed should be a blessing. And he said, through this seed, I will bless a nation. Now, this is where the nation of Israel becomes very important, the physical nation of Israel, to understand their stories and what they went through and the journeys that they experienced and the struggles that they had and the victories that eventually they got and the land that they inherited. To understand all of that, to come and understand the story that you and I have today. That's very important, because once we get this big picture, then when you read the New Testament scriptures, you will be able to pinpoint and say, okay, this is the portion, what I'm reading in the New Testament is this portion of the story in the story of the nation of Israel. So I'm going to actually put some words here on the screen so we can follow together. So we actually came to the story of Abraham, and we realized that from Abraham the seed came, which was Isaac. And then from Isaac a son was born, which was called Jacob. Okay, now Jacob, through some story, God changed his name and gave the name Israel. We don't want to go through all these details for now, but let me just show this here. So Jacob, his name was changed to Israel. Okay, so next thing is actually what happened from Israel, which is from him the 12 sons were born. Okay, so here we have basically, I'm not gonna put all these, but this is the story of the 12 sons who actually became the 12 tribes of Israel. Okay, now this is just the beginning of the story, and what happened through this story is something that again we see in the story of Jesus. So I'm going to just put this here, that out of these 12 basically sons, we had one that was called basically Joseph. And this Joseph was envied by his brothers. The story is long, but I'll make it short. He was sold to Egypt. He went to Egypt, and through God's favor and grace, he became the second man in the land of Egypt. So Joseph went to Egypt. Okay, so now this is the time that through again something that happened in the whole land, which was a famine that came, and God gave basically the Pharaoh a dream, and Joseph interpreted the dream, and he also gave the wisdom on what to do, which was to actually make wheat ready for the time of famine. Egypt became the only land that had food, and all other nations came to actually receive from them. And one of those was actually the sons of Israel. They went to there, they didn't recognize Joseph, but through some stories, eventually he revealed himself to them, and they went back, they brought their father, and the whole house of Israel, which was about 70 people, they entered into Egypt. So here in Egypt, we had all of these Israel being in Egypt. So this is where actually things began to be a bit changed, because Joseph died, and then that Pharaoh died, and the next Pharaoh that came actually wasn't as graceful, he wasn't as merciful, he wasn't anymore in the favor of these people. He began to make a slave of them. Okay, so that's when the nation of Israel was in the nation of Egypt, and instead of being the kingdom of God, they were serving another kingdom, and they were slaves of that kingdom. So I'm going to put this here, that eventually they are now, okay, so Egypt was actually slavery. So this is where God comes to Moses, one who is actually in the same land, one of the Israelites that is in the land of Egypt, and says that I have come to redeem my people as I promised to their father Abraham. And he says that you will be the one who will bring them out. So through so many signs and wonders and plagues that came upon Egyptians and Pharaoh, God brought them out of Egypt, and they entered another stage, which was basically the story of wilderness. Okay, so out of slavery into the wilderness. So they are in wilderness because God also had given another promise, which was to Abraham, and that was to take them eventually to another land, which was called the Promised Land. Okay, so they were to go to the Promised Land. So this was their journey, and this was accomplished obviously by Joshua, and eventually they settled in the land of the promised land. But then something again happened in the promised land, and that was when actually the nation inherited the land. They established their kingdom. Solomon was ruling over the whole land that was promised to Abraham, which was from the river Egypt to river Euphrates, between the land of Egypt and the land of Babylon. And that's when corruption came. Solomon turned away from the Lord, and through basically so many years of corruption in the kings in the land, eventually the land again, the whole nation of Israel this time went under another bondage, another exile, which was to basically Babylon. So I'm going to show this here also, that the next stage is Babylon. And the reason I'm actually putting all of this here is because this is important in our study of all of this. So Babylon. Okay, so next thing happened was after 70 years, God actually changed things and he brought them back to the promised land, and the story was finished. This is the end of all the stories. This is what was supposed to be happening. Okay, this is the end of our story, where we are in the land and we don't go into exile and we remain there. This is the end. Okay, so I just put all of this on the screen because I wanted you to see where we are heading to. From the book of Exodus to the book of 2 Kings, we see this story until they went into the Babylon. So that's the chronology of the Old Testament scriptures. And after that, we begin to read some of the prophets which were actually prophesying in each of these steps. And then through the story of Nehemiah and Zechariah and all of that, we read about their coming back to the land. So that's book-wise, but this was also the story-wise that I put on the screen. Now I'm going to take you to the New Testament and show you why actually I'm saying these things, because these are important. Now, I mean, these are just a few blocks, but each of them are filled with stories. They are filled with types and shadows. They are filled with parables. They are filled with wisdoms for us that can actually help us in our journey. So look at 1 Corinthians chapter 10. This is Paul speaking. In verse 1, we read, "Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that all our fathers were under the cloud and passed through the sea." So Paul goes to this story, what actually I put on the screen, and he says our fathers who were in Egypt, they passed through the sea and they basically left the land of Egypt behind, and they entered into promised land, into wilderness, hoping to get to the promised land. And he says, he's recounting the story, and he says all of them passed through the sea. Verse 2, all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. Now he uses the word baptism. Verse 3, all ate the same spiritual food and all drank the same spiritual drink. So now he's talking about the story of wilderness, because you already know that this is where God gave them manna from heaven, and they drank water, even as it says, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. So he's moving in this story step by step. That's my point. But with most of them, God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in wilderness. What does that mean? They didn't get to the promised land. So that means they were to be entering into the promised land. Okay, verse 6. Now these things became, this is important, our examples. These things became our examples. Okay, everything, Egypt, baptism in the water, baptism in the sea, baptism in the cloud, baptism in Moses, eating spiritual food, eating spiritual drink, all were for our examples, meaning we were to learn something from those stories. There is wisdom in those stories, yet not carnal wisdom. It's a spiritual wisdom, which is the revelation of all those mysteries, what they actually means in you, in me, and in every one of us. Verse 6. Now these things became our examples, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. So he says what they did, okay? And do not become, okay, by the way, what they lusted after was the things they had in Egypt. If you read the story, you're gonna actually see that they say our soul loathes this worthless bread that God is giving us. We want the meat, the pot of meat that we had in Egypt. We want the cucumber and the onion, and they name all those foods. So what they lusted after was the things that they had in Egypt. So Paul says these are like spiritual truths for all of us to realize what God is speaking to us about. Because now, obviously, as an example for us that says they came out of Egypt, he says you came out of your Egypt, but then you had food in this land, and sometimes you turn to actually eat from those, or you find desire for those food. Now, in the context we're going to see later, that food is the food that is given according to its words, teachings that are given according to flesh, according to even old covenant mindset. But that's for another session. Verse 7, and do not become idolaters as were some of them. So he brings the story of idolatry, trying to say now there is a spiritual idolatry. They actually built, they formed, they manufactured a golden calf. But we're not doing this, yet Paul says we are. Because this is now spiritual. And we're going to see all of these later. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose to play. Nor let us commit sexual immorality as some of them did. That means there is a spiritual sexual immorality now. And in one day 23,000 fell. Nor let us tempt Christ. Nor let us tempt Christ as some of them also tempted and were destroyed by the serpents. So the story, again, story of wilderness, serpents came and they bite them. So this is now again saying there is a tempting, which is actually the word testing. The point is not to actually go into details. The point is to see that Paul is showing us every story that happened in that basically story of the nation of Israel, and he tells us that every one of them is important for us to understand. Verse 9, nor complain as some of them also complained and were destroyed by the destroyer. Okay, now look at this. Now all these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom, ready, the end of the ages have come. Okay, those stories, nation of Israel, the lands they were in, the bondage they were in, and the redemption God promised, and the food he gave them, and the drink he gave them, and the wars that they entered, and the battles that they had, the victories, and the inheritance that they got. He says, they were examples and were written for our admonition, upon whom the end of the ages have come. Not that it's going to come, the end of the ages have come. What does that mean? That means we are transitioning out of a fleshly time into a spiritual time. We are transitioning out of flesh into the spirit. We are transitioning out of seeing things according to flesh, physical, natural, into seeing things spiritual. And that is going to strengthen us, not outwardly, but inwardly. and that will cause us to manifest who we are on the inside. And he says, in this story, God is taking you to a land. So you were in the bondage of flesh, Egypt, and he brought you out, and he cut the food of the old. He's giving you manna from heaven, that you may know that man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. So you have strength to carry on into the promised land and destroy all enemies and possess the land that is given you. All of this in a person, which is you. And there is someone that is always going before you. Let's first see it in the Old Testament. Either be Moses to take you from out of Egypt into wilderness, or Joshua to take you out of wilderness, put you into promised land, or to be like David, who in the land of promise destroys all enemies, or be like Solomon, who establishes the temple. It says, now there is a person going always before you, and every one of those persons now find their fulfillment in Christ. So he's your Moses, he's your Joshua, he's your David, he's your Solomon, and everything in between. And he says, let us not tempt Christ. Let us not say this worthless bread. I mean, not to loathe this bread and say it is worthless, because the word of Christ, the mystery of Christ that is being revealed to you, it's food that our Father is giving us from heaven. Even Jesus said in John chapter 6, when he was actually tempted, again tested by Pharisees, they said, what would you give us to believe? Moses gave our fathers bread from heaven, but what would you give? And he said, actually, it is not Moses who gave you food from heaven, it's my Father who gives you bread from heaven, that all who ate of this bread shall have eternal life. And they said, give us this bread. He said, I am that bread of life. Okay, so a revelation of the mystery of Christ in every step of our way toward the full redemption is already foreshadowed in the story of Israel. That's why we are moving to the story of Israel, to see all those details, yet not in the fullness of those details. We're going to cover that in the next series when we start, because the purpose of God's master plan is to actually establish this truth once, that the Old Testament scriptures are super important because they are the mystery, and the New Testament scriptures are super important because they are the revelation of that mystery. So you can't ever have a revelation without having a mystery. So if you read New Testament, you have to go back to the Old Testament scriptures, find where they find their root, look at them, put them side by side, see what was the sea that they were going through and what is the water that we go through in the New Testament. Put them together and see if God says baptism into Moses and then he says baptism into Christ, what do they mean? And put them side by side, and let's understand what the sea was, let's understand what crossing was, let's understand what the food that later they ate was, and through this story we actually gain spiritual understanding, and spiritual understanding feeds your heart. It strengthens you, and then in the inner man you start experiencing growth. You would not become external man, you would be having your food from the spirit that is inside of you, and through that growth begins to happen, and that would be the reason that you can actually move toward your inheritance. So okay, so let's read a couple more verses in 1 Corinthians 10. Verse 12 says, therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you except such is common to men, but God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with every temptation will also make the way of escape, that you may be able to bear. Now, why Paul is saying this? Now, this is specific to what he's saying in chapter 10, because everything that he just said everything that he just said was only for the stage of wilderness. He didn't say anything about Egypt, and he didn't say anything about promised land, and he didn't say anything about their exile in Babylon. He said specifically something about wilderness. Every story, the manna, the spiritual drink, spiritual bread, the destroyer, the serpents that bite them, their complaint, their temptation, every one of those were in that story. And Paul says, okay, see them. They didn't actually get through that land. They didn't go into the promised land, and they died, most of them. And this doesn't bring pleasure to God. Obviously, God's pleasure is when you receive his life. But he says, now, they could have a way out of their temptation. And he says, now for you, God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape that you may be able to bear it. So he says God is able to take you out of the temptations that you may enter in. Now, the temptation in the context is, temptation is something that always deceives you from the truth that you have already heard. In the story of Adam and Eve, that was the temptation. The story of Jesus in wilderness, that was the temptation. In general, wilderness is the story of temptation. So anything that God says is the truth, and you would always have a chance, an opportunity to forget that truth. And he says, well, there would be a time that you would actually experience such things, such temptations, but God, when you put actually your focus on God, then he would make a way. How does he make a way out of temptation? By revealing the truth to you, by showing you again, reminding you why you are here. Now, this is what Paul said before chapter 10. I'm going to read actually in verse 24 that says, do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but one receives the prize? Then run in such a way that you may obtain it. So he says, set your mind this way, like a winner. Don't run to become the second person. Run to get the prize, because only one gets the prize. So he's not trying to say you're in competition with your brothers. He's trying to say, have that mind that you are running. And a runner, what does a runner do? He doesn't distract himself with the things that are actually in front of him. He doesn't carry baggage with him. He doesn't think about other stuff when he's running. He's focused. He's just looking at the vision. He's looking at the end line, and he knows what he's running for. Okay, so verse 25, and everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we for an imperishable crown. Therefore I run thus, not with uncertainty. That's amazing. Thus I fight, not as one who beats the air. That's also amazing. But I discipline my body and bring it to subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself should be disqualified. So he goes to the story of Moses. He says, remember Moses? He preached to others about promised land, but he himself did not enter. He says, I'm not going to be like that. I'm not going to be distracted in wilderness. I'm going to have a way out of temptation with every temptation that comes, and God is faithful to take me out of that. My mind is fixed on the prize. What I'm looking for is the fullness of redemption, which is the fullness of Christ in me, by the way, so that he redeems me from every bondage that I've been in, every exiles that I've been in. He can bring me out. And he says this must remind us of the story of Egypt, those who actually died in wilderness. Let us not become like them. Let's not do what they did. Let's look at actually what was supposed to be done differently. Now, for that, we have the story of Jesus. He was in wilderness 40 days. They were 40 years. He was there for 40 days. And the only temptation that he had was, if you are the Son of God. So he says, I'm going to actually discipline my body that says otherwise. And everything else, I'm going to make them subject to me and not me subject to them. And that means I'm going to actually be fixing on gaining something that God says is available right now, and I'm looking for that fullness of redemption. I'm not looking for my death. I'm not looking for going to heaven. God said, come out of Egypt. And when I came out of Egypt, I wasn't actually in a literal Egypt. I was in my own body. And when he said, okay, let me take you through wilderness, I didn't go anywhere. I was here. So when he says, let me take you to promised land, I'm not going to go anywhere. I'm still here. What is happening is in one man, one story, one man who is experiencing all of these stories spiritually. And he says, that means the spirit that is inside of us must raise up so high that reigns over us in fullness, so the soul and the body are subject to that spirit. And he says this happens if you only listen to basically the revelation of the mystery that God is giving you, and through that spirit to receive strength step by step. If necessary, one day to drink spiritual drink, he will give it to you. If you want spiritual food, he will give it to you, and the rest of the stories. But then we're going to look at all of this. Today was actually only an intro to the story of Israel, because eventually we're going to end this series with the end of the story of Israel. But it's necessary to have this introduction to these stories, so that we can step by step look at all these blocks that I put here: Egypt, wilderness, promised land, Babylon, and then find them in the New Testament. And when we move to other series and we look at different subjects, different topics, different revelations, then actually they carry weight, and we have that Old Testament scriptures. I hope this was clear enough and it's helpful, but always you can also let us know about basically what you are experiencing, or if you have any questions. Definitely in YouTube you can leave a comment, or you can always email as well. So blessings to you guys, and we'll see you the next time.